I'm Annette Pasternak, the Stop Skin Picking Coach, and today I want to talk to you about self-compassion because chances are if you have a problem picking at your skin, you're also probably really hard on yourself mentally, kind of that beating yourself up and in a way almost picking at yourself mentally as well as physically. And so we're going to talk about how you can change that, where our minds are actually very flexible, and with a little effort, we can become nicer to ourselves. Some of you may know I did a survey a few months ago for my new book, which will be coming out in a few months, so look out for that. The survey was asking skin pickers in some stage of recovery for advice, things they've learned that they would share with others, okay? And I've compiled them into a book, with some narrative and stories and all that. One of the most common themes that kept coming up was women practicing self-compassion, kindness to themselves, and saying that that was a really important skill that they had to learn in order to stop picking, or in order to reduce their picking, or even just in order to be okay with themselves while they're picking. So I have first a few quotes. This is kind of like a little preview for the book, if you will, around the theme. Lottie says, "The more loving and caring I was about myself and my body, the less picking urges I had." Mandy said, "Even if I do pick, instead of beating myself up, I talk myself down from this horrible cycle of unrealistic thoughts in my head. It helps a lot." Lisa says, "Recovery is a continual process. Forgive yourself and move on if you have a relapse." Finally, Tara says, "Learning how to be really kind to yourself is hard work. It's crazy. It shouldn't be, but it is really, really hard work, especially for skin pickers because we're perfectionists. Psychologically and physically, we pick at ourselves. So if it's skin, it's going to be really hard to cultivate self-care. But it gets easier and easier the more you practice it." Thanks to these 4 women. If you found that advice helpful, please hit the like button. So I read this book over the summer, Self-Compassion, Kristin Neff, Ph.D. She does a really nice job at compiling the research and explaining a lot of the research around self-compassion and the benefits of it, as well as breaking it down into certain exercises you can do, as well as telling her own story and how this was helpful for her to practice self-compassion. So the author makes the case that a lot of anxiety and depression, and I would say skin picking too, are due to self-judgment, right? Would you agree with that? This beating ourselves up for not measuring up to whatever standard, usually they're internal standards, right? I mean, it could be what somebody else expects, but more it's just what we expect. And that goes along with perfectionism, which is a personality trait that it kind of tends to be the skin picking personality in a lot of ways. Perfectionism is kind of the compulsive need to accomplish our goals without giving any allowance for doing not quite as good as what we wanted. This kind of all or nothing thinking means we're inevitably disappointed. Okay, and this kind of outlook really needs to be changed in order to get better from the skin picking, in order to make progress, because it's rarely, I've been doing tons of this to, I don't do it anymore. That just doesn't happen. Perfectionists are more likely to have eating disorders, anxiety, depression, a whole host of other psychological problems. There are 3 core components of self-compassion. First, being kind to ourselves. So this, if you pay attention, so many of us say mean things to ourselves all day long, and we really need to be better friends with ourselves. Like, why would you be so mean to yourself when that would be horrible treatment if somebody said it to you or if you said it to somebody else? So, anything that you wouldn't say to a good friend, or to any friend, or a child, don't say it to yourself if it doesn't hold up to that standard. Be a good friend to yourself. Be kind. Number two, recognizing that we all suffer. So everybody feels inadequate, frustrated, out of control, or disappointed at times. And those kind of feelings are felt by everyone some of the time. So this is just the human experience. It can help that we recognize when we recognize we all suffer. That's part of the self-compassion process, is to realize that we're connected. We're all human and connected, and we're not alone in this misery that we're feeling, no matter what it is. And the third core component of self-compassion is being mindful of what is. This is mindfulness, which is the clear seeing and non-judgmental acceptance of what is occurring in the present moment. So we all have this innate tendency, it's just evolutionarily, we have an innate tendency to avoid pain, to go away from it. But in this process of being mindful, we actually have to not do that. We have to pay attention to the pain and accept it. So for example, mindfulness, instead of just feeling anger, I'm aware that I'm feeling angry. You see the difference? It's also similar to being in a movie theater. That's the analogy, is that there are times in the movies where you're totally drawn into the picture, into the story, and you forget that you're sitting in a theater, or you just don't have that awareness at the moment. You're so into it. And then at other moments, suddenly you could just recognize you're seeing the whole theater, or you're seeing and hearing people, or you're feeling what you're noticing, the sensations of, say, being scared at a horror movie, or laughing or crying or whatever. So that's the difference. That's what mindfulness is. And mindfulness is very important to practice. And all these three components of self-compassion, being kind to ourselves, recognizing all of us suffer, and being mindful, all of those are potential ways into self-compassion. Okay, so whenever you're feeling upset with yourself, whether it's just how you behave to yourself, or if you've had an argument with somebody, or if you feel embarrassed, or you've done something wrong, any of these things, any kind of emotional pain, really, when you're feeling those things, then you can practice self-compassion by any of these ways. I really like this exercise where she has you do a mantra, so to speak, where you actually prepare in advance statements that you say to yourself whenever you recognize you're feeling in pain, and you say them to reassure yourself and practice self-compassion. So for example, here's a 3-sentence mantra. This is a moment of suffering. Everyone feels this way sometimes. May I be kind to myself and give myself the self-compassion I need. And you can do that, if you're comfortable, if it feels nice, maybe hold your heart. That can be that's a really kind, gentle way to give yourself self-compassion. Or you just say it, whatever you prefer. But definitely, this is a practice. I would practice it though. Like those women in the beginning said, they found it really, really key for themselves and their skin picking. Whenever you're in some kind of pain, there are 3 courses of action you can take according to each of those 3 components of self-compassion. So number 1, you can give yourself kindness and care. Number 2, you can remind yourself that encountering pain is part of the shared human condition. And 3, you can practice mindful awareness of your thoughts and your emotions. Another thing I really thought was interesting and liked in this book is her contrast of self-compassion and self-esteem. And she makes the case that, based on a lot of research, that self-compassion is much more valuable than self-esteem, because self-esteem is like thinking well of yourself for how good you do something, right? How good you are at something, or how good you look, or something like that. And so the downfall of that is, okay, well, what if all of a sudden you're not good at that, or your looks go, or whatever? I was talking to a client last week whose friends, she's got one group of friends who all look like supermodels. I was like, well, I know that's difficult. Self-compassion, like, tell yourself, like, oh, this is hard. This is not comfortable. Everyone, like, she gets ignored, going out with them. But this is a human emotion that everyone feels sometime. And I kind of reminded her, like, or I kind of said, these friends are going to have a harder time when they get old. And their looks go. And that's going to be hard. Another thing about self-esteem is it depends on somebody else, right? Somebody else's perception of us. Whereas self-compassion, it only depends on yourself. Like, you can give yourself self-compassion no matter what. You can forgive yourself. You can just like say, like, you know what? It's okay. You didn't do as good as you wanted. Rumination, going over and over negative thoughts in your mind, thinking negative stuff, replaying things in the past, thinking about possible things in the future that might go wrong. This rumination, this is like being into the movie of your mind. You're drawn into the movie of your mind. But with self-compassion, with awareness, you can kind of take yourself out, and then you can use these 3 steps. You can use your self-compassion mantra whenever you notice that you're ruminating. Okay, that's a time that a lot of people are picking, right? It's like this room, they're just going over stuff about the day. It doesn't have to be negative, but it often is, or past things that happened, or worry about future things. And this is why depression and anxiety often go together, is that they're both problems of rumination. Depression is ruminating too much on the past. Anxiety is ruminating on the future, like negative, depression, thinking about negative stuff from the past. Anxiety, thinking about possible negative stuff in the future. But you can learn to interrupt that and talk to yourself in a gentle, more positive way, reassuring, self-compassionate way. Finally, I want to talk about the role of self-compassion in forgiving yourself. For example, forgiving yourself after you've had a picking lapse, an episode, or, a relapse. Maybe you've been doing really well. Any of these instances. Because we tend to feel really badly afterwards. That's actually optional when you have self-compassion. And it actually doesn't help. I mean, we might think, oh, but if I didn't feel badly, I would do it more. No, that's not the case. So I thought this was really interesting. There is research, there's no research, as far as skin picking, but there is some interesting research here with eating. So she says self-compassion involves forgiving yourself for your lapses. And she's talking about a self-compassionate response to breaking a diet. If your ultimate goal is to be healthy, she says, and it doesn't really matter if you fall off your diet from time to time. We're not machines, right? Most people fluctuate in their ability to stay focused on their eating goals. This is very, very similar to picking. 2 steps forward, 1 step back seems to be the natural way of things. I've highlighted this whole thing and written picking in my notes in the book. Okay, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. That's the natural way. You gotta keep that in mind. By having compassion for yourself when you fall off your diet or the picking, you'll be less driven to overeat or pick as a way to make you feel better afterwards. So she talks about a recent study supporting this claim. I thought this was interesting. So female undergrads in college were asked to eat a donut as part of a research study. And then half the participants were given instructions to make them feel self-compassionate. So about, more compassionate about actually indulging in the sweet donut. So they said, several people have told me that they feel bad about eating donuts in this study. So I hope you won't be hard on yourself. Everyone eats unhealthily sometimes, and everyone in the study eats this stuff. So I don't think there's any reason to really feel bad about it. The other half of the women, the control group, they were not told anything. Okay, so they weren't given this like nice, compassionate pep talk or whatever. Researchers found that the women who did not have the pep talk felt more guilty and ashamed about eating the donut and then ate more later. Yeah, so later, both groups were given candy as a taste testing session, supposed taste testing session. The women who were not given that compassionate talk ended up eating more of the candy. So the ones that were encouraged to be self-compassionate ate less later with the candy. And the women who were not encouraged to be self-compassionate ate more candy. So I think this is really nice research study showing that when you're self-compassionate, it's going to be helpful in actually doing less of the damaging behavior. I think even though there's no research on this for skin picking, I would bet that it's completely translatable. It seems that way from what I've noticed with clients, and then, the quotes that you heard earlier from my upcoming book from these women. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Give it a thumbs up, hit the like button if you like it, and please share your experience, and please practice self-compassion. Please be kind to yourselves, and I'll have more videos coming up, so subscribe if you're interested.